That's Dragonese, for I'm really excited to talk about this. The dragons wag their tails.
And welcome back to another bookworm review. I know what you're thinking. You're like, Kiara, what happened to idea sex? It's still idea sex, okay? Except instead of the intercourse of ideas from different cultures, thinkers, and disciplines, today we are just focused on one person's work, and that is Robert A. Monroe. So we're not connecting dots so much as we are taking a deep dive into one thinker. And Robert A. Monroe is the person who coined the term out-of-body experience. His book, Journeys Out of the Body, is what put this on the map. And so I'd like to use this book as a jumping off point or a launch pad into talking about OBEs, but also the contributions that Monroe made. Contributions to that field of study that we talk about so often on this channel. Call it psi research, call it parapsychology, call it research into consciousness. I'm not particularly fond of any of those terms. I think that when this kind of stuff hits the mainstream, and it will in our lifetimes, when it hits the mainstream, someone's going to come up with a different term for it. But, you know, the field of study that attempts to bridge spirituality and science. And Monroe, his big contribution to this is his search for empirical evidence around out-of-body experiences. So let's start with this. What is an out-of-body experience? I think of it as you and I are like sock puppets. Okay, this is our sock, and the sock of the sock puppet is like our physical body. This is what we incarnate as. It's as we exist in this time-space dimension. And what animates the sock is consciousness. Would technically be a mirror image, but. And when we die, we exit the sock. However, in an out-of-body experience, you are exiting the sock before you're actually dead. You remain tethered to this time-space dimension. If it sounds crazy, it kind of is. But is it real? I am inclined to believe that it's a very real possibility after having read Monroe's work and also knowing that the kind of work that the CIA and other government entities have conducted around this. The CIA started taking a real interest in psi research in like the Cold War. They got really big into like remote viewing and the like. And there's actually a declassified CIA, acronyms are so hard. I'm dyslexic, it doesn't help. There's a declassified CIA document floating around in the interwebs that basically confirms that reality is a hologram and astral projection is real. We're gonna do another declassified video on that where we actually take a really like technical academic essay and break it down in a way that like normal people can understand, but idea sex for another time. I don't think there's conclusive proof that OBEs exist. I think that if there was, everyone would know about it and everyone would believe in it. But I think it's a very real possibility, and I don't think that the CIA would have dumped like millions of taxpayer dollars into researching this kind of stuff unless there was something to it. So, but you be the judge. I'm just here for the idea sex. And I also think that it's worth noting that Monroe takes a very clinical look at all of this. One of the reasons that I think his work has a lot of credibility is because even though he had this experience, he wasn't like, hey, everyone, this is real. Instead, he started looking for ways to verify his experiences. He started looking for empirical evidence. Is this something that we can actually prove? Or am I a loon? Like that was literally what he was trying to do. And he invited scientists to study him for people to hook him up to EEGs and see what was happening in his brain during these experiences. Monroe was a pretty successful businessman, and he was hesitant about publishing this book because he was like, people are gonna think I'm nuts. And it's actually pretty interesting that as a businessman, his circle of friends seem to all be psychiatrists and psychologists and like doctors. Those are just the circles he runs in. So when he starts having these experiences, he goes to them and he's like, hey, am I crazy? Do you think I'm crazy? Help. There doesn't appear to be anything wrong with him. He actually seems like a very like grounded, rational human being. And he falls into this by accident. He starts listening to these tapes for like relaxation and meditation. And at some point during his like meditation practice, it's more or less what it is, he gets this really awful stomach ache, like in his solar plexus. He's been doing this for months, and he thinks he's sick or something. And he goes to bed that night, and his entire body starts to vibrate. And it snaps him up like he's falling asleep, and he snaps awake because he's like, what the hell is going on? Like, is it an earthquake? Is it like, what's wrong with me? And he looks around and nothing's wrong. And he goes back to sleep. But this pattern of vibrating continues to happen over the course of weeks until finally, and this is actually when he starts going to psychologists and psychiatrists, and he's like, hey, why am I vibrating? What's wrong with me? And they screen him and they can't find anything that appears to be wrong. And so this goes on for some time until finally he's falling asleep one night, and he bumps his shoulder. And he's like, oh, I must have ended up on the floor, because he's not in his bed. He's just against a surface. And then he looks around a little and he realizes that he's next to the chandelier. And then he looks down and sees there's a bed, and there's his wife in the bed, and there's a man next to his wife. And he's like, well, who the hell is that? And he moves down toward the body and realizes that it's him. And then panics and desperately scrambles to get back into his body. Wakes up, looks around, and everything seems normal. And he was like, well, that was a weird dream. But this keeps happening. In fact, it happens for years, and about a year into this, he begins to entertain the idea that like, oh, well, maybe this isn't a dream. Maybe this is a second body state. And so he gets involved with what they call the underground today. It's still kind of underground, but this idea of psychics, of mystics, these people who are attuned to the mystical underpinnings of the world, and begins to research and comes to the conclusion that it is possible that he may be experiencing a sort of separation from his body. And to him, this is confirmation of having a soul, of the fact that we are immortal beings. And here's where I think this gets really interesting. If you take a look at the cover, you see that it's like a cutout shadow of a dude, and then it's got like versions of him around him. When I first picked up this book, the first thing that I thought of was how similar it looked to the cover of the Holographic Universe by Michael Talbot. This book is a your mind will be blown. It will be on the floor. But suffice to say, I'm digressing a little. These books have basically the same cover. And I thought that was really interesting, because this is about the fact that we live in a hologram, right? And this is about the fact that astral projection could very well be real. And in that CIA paper, the one that we're going to do a declassified on, it's all about, it connects both of these things. Because what drives both of these things, these ideas, is the idea that humans are multi-dimensional beings. So what Monroe ended up proposing, not in this book, but later, you can listen to him talk about it in interviews, is that consciousness is a spectrum. And what I mean by that is, for the most part, when we experience existing, right, it kind of feels like we're centered right here. We're like a little pilot behind our eyes or something. And this is where consciousness starts and ends. Consciousness, though, according to Monroe and a lot of the work based around consciousness is non-local, meaning it's not really centered here. It's not really centered anywhere. And so to go back to our sock puppet idea, Monroe had the idea that we can phase in and out of what he would call time-space, this time-space dimension, right? So our physical 3D reality, this matrix that we exist in, for the most part, we experience it as like consciousness in the sock puppet. When we daydream, our mind is a little bit somewhere else, right? Maybe, and he calls this phasing. We're like 5% phased out of our body. When we meditate, we can go a little deeper. In a shamanic trance, we're quite a bit deeper, where we are still physically here, but we're having experiences that appear to be in other dimensions or realities, an altered state of consciousness. Same thing happens with psychedelics. Now, in an OBE, we are as far as we can be, phased as far as we can be. We're like 90% phased out of our body, out of this time-space reality, while still being tethered to it. So 100% phased out is death. That's when the sock no longer exists. And one of the really interesting things about OBEs, according to Monroe, is that when people have this experience, they no longer fear death because you realize that you are an infinite being. It took Monroe a long time to get to this point. And in the CIA document too, they talk about how it takes years to be able to get to the point where you're able to do something like this, and how do you train for it and the like. Monroe actually opened up an institute. You can check it out. I'll drop a link called the Monroe Institute. I believe it's based in Virginia, and it's all about helping people reach this state, to have this experience. And so in the book, Monroe he's mostly going on adventures, so these little like nightly escapades where he goes into different locales. And locale 1, I won't go through all of them, but he's got like locale 1, locale 2, locale 3. I think there's 4. And the first one is a lot like this reality. It actually is this reality, but people can't see you. Think of like how we think of ghosts, right? And it's in this locale, this dimension, where he has the most empirical evidence. And so, for example, there was one story where when you're in the second body state, think of like fast travel in a video game, right? Like if you ever played the Elder Scrolls and you need to go to another country and you just like use the fast travel, right? So you click a button and then you're there. Second body state works the same way. Second body being the body in the sock puppet, right? Where he thinks of something, usually sets an intention, can be an emotion, but will often think of a person, and it will magnetize him to that point. And so he'll go and he'll like visit his friends when he's in the state and trying to collect evidence. And there's this one story. He's got a lot of really interesting ones that seem to confirm, like other people confirm that they had some sort of experience that mirrored what he was doing. But the one that got me was he went and visited this lady who was having a conversation with her daughter at the table, and he was trying to get her attention. And so he reaches out and he pinches her, and she yells, and then he snaps back to his body and wakes up. And the next day, this lady calls him, and she was like, "Did you pinch me?" And she had a bruise right in the place where he pinched her. A rather strange coinky-dink, don't you think? And so he had lots of stories like this in the book where he would witness what people were doing and then later be able to call them and be like, "Hey, were you at this place at this time doing this thing?" And people would be like blown away. And it's difficult, according to Monroe, moving through the different dimensions is difficult because one of the things you have to face, especially early on, is fear. And it's like this sort of all-consuming fear when you come out of your body. Because I imagine if this is real, it's probably an uncomfortable place to be if you're not used to it. And so a lot of his initial obstacles are trying to figure out how to travel and also how to overcome the fear of what's happening to him. And then there's other dimensions. He encounters one that sounds a lot like heaven. He encounters different beings. I really like his take on spirit guides. So that has certain connotations in like New Age circles. According to him, spirit guides you access at a certain dimension. So if you, maybe dimension isn't the right word here. He calls them focuses, and they also call it focus in the CIA paper. I wonder how much they borrowed from Monroe when they were studying this kind of thing. But you can think of it as happening in like layers, and there's different focuses, and you would tune into them in the same way that you would like tune a radio, right? Like you have to get the right frequency, and then you can phase into these different layers, these different focuses. And in focus 21, he says, is where you can encounter spirit guides. And he says that spirit guides, they're sort of like these helpers that assist you with your life here on Earth in this incarnation. But what's interesting about them is who they are. They are you, as you have existed in past lives. And I thought that was so interesting because often in New Age circles, when people talk about spirit guides, they talk about them as being like angels or ancestors or animal totems. And I thought that it was really interesting that he talked about spirit guides as being facets of who we are, sort of like our soul is multifaceted. And when we experience a lifetime, we then carry that lifetime with us through other lifetimes. We've talked about that a little bit before here. What I also found interesting about this book is how much it overlapped in some ways with the work of Raymond Moody, who is the grandfather of the near-death experience. He's the person who first started researching that. That's become its own field of study these days. And also overlaps a little bit with what I know of Michael Newton's work. And he's the person who did, he made past life regression a field of study. And we're going to get into all of that here on Idea Sex. I think our next stint, we've been talking about spiritual awakening. I think our next little series here is going to be on near-death experiences. If you're interested in NDEs, which OBEs are related to, right? It's this idea that we transcend these physical bodies and the evidence for that. OBEs and NDEs, near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences, are really getting at the same thing, which is that we are not these physical forms. We are actually the consciousness that animates them. We have a second body that is immortal. And I think it's really interesting that this is such a real possibility and that the mainstream isn't more interested in it, because everyone on this planet has a vested interest in what happens after we die. Like, don't you kind of want to know? Don't you? And we think of life as being like this grand mystery, and it is, and it always will be. But I feel like the reason that we don't know more about what comes next, or more about like psi, the real nature of reality, I feel like the reason that we don't know as much about these things as we maybe could is because people just don't go there. And if we actually applied like our modern science and our collective brains on topics like this, I think that we would experience incredible growth. It would be like a psychic renaissance. Do you know what I mean? I think people would be shocked at what comes out when we stop trying to study the physical world and start trying to study consciousness. If he's even a little bit right, our entire model of reality shifts. And I think that there's enough evidence that our curiosity should at least be piqued. If the topic of NDEs, OBEs, the possibility of a second body, if this interests you, do stay tuned, because I think this is the next rabbit hole we are going to go down. We kept it pretty high level today, looked at one person's work, very much like a high-level overview, but we are going to get deeper into the science of this. We're going to look at a lot of different evidence. And if this interests you, another thing you may be interested in is the Institute of Noetic Sciences has a free webinar available until the end of the month. So March 31st, 2021. They usually keep it gated, but for various reasons, they've decided to bring it out for a little while. So if you're interested in NDEs and want to see some field experts talk about it, I will drop a link in the description. And yeah, what do you think? Do you believe in a second body? Do you believe in a soul? What would it take to convince you? Let me know in the comments. And until next time, much love and stay blessed. Does the dragon head on my wall make me like a cannibal? I feel bad, like when you feed pigs pork, like you know there's something wrong with that.